Mother Earth, beauty and life, all the people, her children, her strife. Within her womb, her arms embrace, of everything living, her smiling face. Mother Earth, we hear your sigh. The pain you suffer, we hear your cry. Rainbow children, open your ears. Together forever, we must dry her tears. Mother Earth, sincere in feeling, her care is ours. Let's help her healing. Children of the earth, understand her plight. Take care of her every day and night. Thousands of years ago, the charging waters of Lake Bonneville shaped the face of East Idaho when its natural boundary collapsed, and the resulting flood changed the landscape for hundreds of miles. Lake Bonneville was located in north-central Utah. It was fed by the Bear River until 15,000 years ago. Lake Bonneville was the largest stage of the ancient lake that is now the Great Salt Lake. The catastrophic flood that followed was immense. Nearly 1,000 cubic miles escaped Lake Bonneville. The flood took about a year to complete. The maximum flow lasted about 8 weeks. It has been calculated that it was about 5 times the flow of the Amazon River. The Lake Bonneville flood broke through the dam at Red Rock Pass between Downey and Swan Lake. About 400 feet of water from Lake Bonneville came flooding north through Marsh Valley and Ingham and then out into the Pocatello area.
Because the water was moving through the constriction between Ingham and here because it was 300 or 400 feet deep, at a high velocity, it was ripping out bedrock. It was tearing up the bedrock, tearing up the basalt flows. And then when it started to slow down, it deposited those boulders that it had eroded from the gap, deposited those boulders as a fan out onto the Pocatello Valley and out onto the Snake River Plain.
The flow happened just when Native Americans were coming into this country. It is not certain if Indians inhabited the area at the time, but if so, home sites, teepee sites, or even entire villages could have been destroyed. The Bonneville flood is more than a geologic event. It is, in effect, the beginning of history. Just like a baby is born after its mother's water is broken, the birth of Native American and European American history of eastern Idaho follows the outpouring of this water that reshaped the land.
Portneuf Gap is really the reason that Pocatello is located where it is, because Portneuf Gap is the gap through the mountains where the railroad could be routed so that then a railroad could be built north to Montana and west to Oregon with a junction at Pocatello. And so that, starting in 1882, was the reason that Pocatello was built.
Well, my father talked about our mountains here. Mount Putnam, and he said that mountain has a lot of traditional food, I'll call it. It has these edible plants that's growing up in the mountains, and it has a buffalo, and the deer and antelope and whatever kind of food you're looking for. They're all there up in the mountains.
The area, once carved by floodwaters, became part of the homeland for 2 nomadic tribes, the Shoshone and the Bannock. Both were hunter-gatherers who moved with the seasons, seeking the bounties of the land. The Shoshone generally stayed to the north and lived in the Lemhi Valley. regularly traveling to the Yellowstone area for food. The Bannocks occupied areas to the south. Their range included parts of Nevada and southern Utah. However, both tribes at times would make this area home. The big draw to this area was abundant wild game and native animals the tribes could use for food and clothing. However, a non-native animal may have had the biggest impact on the lifestyle of people in this area.
Receiving the horse was a huge factor in the changes of how our lifestyle has changed. We actually acquired the horse from the Spaniards, and the Spaniards' history stems all the way back to the 1500s, but we were able to acquire the horse back in the late 1700s, and once we received the horse, that changed everything. It made mode of transportation a lot easier and faster for our people to be able to follow the buffalo route through Montana. It also allowed us to easily defeat some of our enemy tribes that didn't have the horse, and for us to get away a little bit faster and quicker.
And the horse becomes a dominant part of Shoshone life, that it becomes not only the main transportation tool, and it expands the range of the world dramatically, but it becomes a symbol of wealth and certainly a source of wealth and power. Riding horseback, Shoshone people particularly, had become one of the most powerful societies of this part of North America by the middle 1700s. And their range of influence, their range of control, not only was centered here in southeastern Idaho, it extended to the south, extended far to the northeast on the Great Plains as well.
Jim Bridger was a mountain man, so he stayed with the Bannock tribe a couple winters, and he watched how they hunted buffalo, and he was fascinated with the way they operated and how they knew about the land.
In 1805, Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to get to know the plants, area, animals, and people of the West. Although they used a Shoshone Indian, Sacagawea, as their guide, Lewis and Clark's journey did not pass through East Idaho. However, they did have an indirect impact on Pocatello and the area. Lewis and Clark were fastidious note-takers and left a legacy of documentation. This legacy opened the door to the West and its streams rich with beaver. At that time in history, beaver fur was one of the world's largest trading commodities. This helped usher in the era of the fur trapper. The fur traders were the first European people to explore our valleys and report back to an outside world. Much of what we know about the geography of this area, much of what we know about the resources and people, came from some of those fur traders. Many traders made a name for themselves and shaped the region's development in the process. Rugged risk-takers like Jedediah Smith, William Sublett, Jim Bridger, and others explored and mapped much of our area.
Some of the first mountain men in this area belonged to the Hudson Bay Company, and they'd come down. They had what they called the Snake River Brigades, where they'd come down from Fort Astoria on the Columbia River, come all the way down here to trap out beaver. These fur traders, to find the beaver, they went everywhere. All these little streams, like Mink Creek in this area, supplied beaver. The Portneuf River that runs through our city here in Pocatello is named after a fur trapper with the Hudson Bay Company. By the 1830s, though, the Indians are seeing more and more people come in. 1834 saw a man from Massachusetts, Nathaniel Wyeth, who'd been out here 2 years before, and he'd signed a contract with the fur trappers to supply them at the rendezvous of 1836 with goods from St. Louis. Well, the company he signed his contract with had gone out of business, had sold out, and the new company wouldn't recognize his contract, so there were two people racing to the rendezvous with all these supplies. Nathaniel Wyeth got beat out. He was a little bit of a greenhorn, though he was a fast learner. And here this Iceman from Massachusetts finally discovers himself in Wyoming with thousands of dollars worth of trade goods and nobody to trade him for furs. So he went to the port, practically to the mouth of the Portneuf River where it dumps into the Snake, or right close to there, shot a buffalo, was in the process of building a fort. This is where we're going to build a fort. He named it Fort Hall, which was after one of his head financiers from back east. You know, it was kind of a political deal. We'll name it Fort Hall. Maybe he'll give me more money.
By 1836, the Hudson Bay Company recognized the profit that could be made at Fort Hall and decided to purchase it from Nathaniel Wyeth.
The fort that we know from the replica is actually the Hudson Bay Fort. The original Fort Hall was slightly smaller, approximately 80 foot by 80 foot. And the Hudson Bay Company come in and expanded it out to be 100 foot by 100 foot. This was later to become quite a stopping spot on the Oregon Trail and of great importance. But for the fur traders, this was a spot, this was like the Walmart of the area, and for the Indian people too, the Native American people, they could come in and trade. It's kind of interesting, as I said, the relationship between the whites and the Indians in this area was fairly good. Nevertheless, the whites had two prices, one for other trappers and one for Native Americans. This is the way this was business at that time. You know, it may be wrong, it may be bad, but that was the way it was done. Around here have a lot of names of famous fur trappers. We think of Kit Carson. He was at Fort Hall. Bonneville was probably through Fort Hall at one time or another. Jim Bridger may or may not have been actually at Fort Hall. He definitely knew about Fort Hall. A lot of Pocatello streets are actually named after fur traders. There's Day Street, Sublet Street, Young Street. These are different people that had different fur traders that had ties with this area. 1836 also marked the first year that a white woman came to the fort, and the first year a wagon was brought to the fort. And so the Oregon Trail was being established as far as Fort Hall as being travelable by wagons.
The fur trappers provided knowledge and wider understanding of this area, with direct contact and interaction with the Shoshone and Bannock tribes. They brought economic development and integration with the outside world in a more permanent and everlasting way. It wasn't the last time that would happen. It's a theme that is repeated over and over in Pocatello history. History's largest peacetime migration. Hundreds of thousands of pioneers would pass through this area on their way west. More than ever, this region became a crossroads and an essential stop on the main Oregon Trail route.
And the first white women were missionaries, the Methodist missionaries, Narcissus Whitman and Eliza Spalding. And they came west with their husbands, their new husbands, Henry Spalding and Marcus Whitman, who had been out west before and along what's now the Oregon Trail. They kind of opened up the way for major influxes of whites to come in here. And these Indians that had kind of watched with a watchful eye the fur trappers come in. By the early 1840s, 1842, 1843, when you are getting a wagon train with nearly 1,000 people, they're going, oh, whoa, wait, this isn't good for us, because it was right through the middle of their hunting grounds, right through the middle of their territory. They had people would insult them, people stole from them, people shot at them just when they saw them. All these kinds of things happened. It kind of broke down a relationship that had been established with the mountain men. And by the very early 1860s, then there was no relationship between the whites and the Indians of this area.
As the years passed, the number of pioneers using the trail multiplied, farmers rushing toward free land in the west, and 49ers headed toward the goldfields of California converged to form a virtual river of people carving a channel through the region.
There are two sources of influx into Idaho in the early 1860s that gives the reason, the cause for creating Idaho Territory in 1863. The largest of those numbers is miners no longer are coming through Idaho on their way to California or Nevada, but now they're coming to Idaho for mines. There's also a smaller number of people starting to come into what is today Idaho from the south. And it's a very different influx of migrants, and these are Latter-day Saint farming communities.
My great-grandmother, Elizabeth Crook, panting. I can tell you a story or two about her. Crossing the plains, of course, was terribly hard, and the story is they were stuck in the snow in a terrible blizzard. In order to keep her children alive, Elizabeth would put them in the cart with the people that had died on the trail because they didn't stop to bury them, to bury the dead. They had to bury them at the end of the day. So they had a cart that would carry the deceased, people that were dying. And the only way she kept her baby, Jane, my great-grandmother, alive was to put her in the cart with these people that were passing away or had died.
And so we have two different groups, the largest of which being miners who create a population base that are here in Idaho to stay. And thus it gives reason for the creation of Idaho Territory, which Abraham Lincoln signs into law in March of 1863. The presence of miners and the presence of farmers, miners being in central Idaho, the farmers being in southeastern Idaho, and farms arising say, in the Treasure Valley near Boise, basically to feed the mines and the miners up in the mountains, do give rise to growing conflict with the Native American tribes of this region. And the 1860s really starts us off on a series of wars between white settlers, miners, and native tribes. And we see that starting in the 1860s, around the time of the creation of Idaho Territory. And that will very much shape the negotiations between those groups over time.
In 1863, a series of skirmishes between the farmers of the Cache Valley and local bands of Shoshone led to the deployment of the American Militia Unit from California, who came in and, on a bitterly cold January morning along the Bear River, attacked a village of Shoshone tribal members. By most accounts, it was the largest Indian massacre in all American history. Hundreds of villagers, Shoshone men, women, and children of various ages were killed. It was called the Bear River Massacre.
In summer of 1863 at Fort Bridger, both parties agree to a treaty that says that the local tribes will allow travelers to come through this region unimpeded. They promise not to attack. Also, there's a treaty signed called the Box Elder Treaty, signed by the Shoshone of our region, that agrees to a similar agreement not to attack settlers and wagon trains who are rightfully coming through this area. Gives them a promise, though, a recognition of land. And the Box Elder Treaty of 1863 recognizes that Pocatello, Chief Pocatello, has a traditional land claim. And that land claim, according to that treaty, stretches from the Raft River in the west to the Portneuf Mountains in the east. So it's one of the first times we get written in a legal document that for Shoshone people this is an area of land to claim. Now it's a very wide stretch of almost all of southeast Idaho today. But that's what's written in 1863. Those negotiations will continue, and particularly as people come into Idaho during the course of the 1860s, more miners, more farmers coming into Idaho, those tensions increase, and there's demand for more clear agreements with the Indian tribes. And that leads to the major treaty in this area with the Shoshone and Bannock, and that's the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868, which establishes that there will be a reservation created in southeast Idaho, what's now the Fort Hall Reservation. Now the exact boundaries of that reservation come later and are determined by presidential order later by 1869. But nonetheless, the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868 is when, from the Shoshone perspective, they've signed a promise that they will give up a way of life that dates back thousands of years. But in exchange, they're hoping to get some security that they can have a homeland of their own.
Besides the treaties of the 1860s, the federal government and the Shoshone tribe would sign several more treaties in the 1880s and 1890s that would reshape the reservation's boundaries.
We have here our present boundary of the 544,000 acres of where our reservation and the present day is. In the reservation period, we lost a significant amount of land. Again, you'll see here in 1880s, which was ratified by Congress in 1889, you'll see that we actually owned a majority of southeastern Idaho here. And then again in 1898, which was ratified by Congress in 1900, you'll see that we owned this portion but lost this portion. But again, this portion here had the Camas Prairie, and so this is how we were able to lose it, was by the misspelling of Kansas Prairie, where we have our present day boundary lines here. And you'll see that the whole state of Idaho, this is where we're at when we look at the whole state of Idaho.
(1869) was the first year the Fort Hall Reservation was defined. It was also a monumental year for America, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. This transportation breakthrough linked the eastern and western halves of the country, with the railroad's final spikes driven just south of Pocatello on the northern edge of the Great Salt Lake at Promontory Summit. The railroad became the dominant economic force that shaped the region's history through the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th, giving rise to the city of Pocatello in the late 1800s. Pocatello was the junction site of the Oregon Short Line and Union Pacific tracks. Along the tracks, a number of buildings went up alongside tents to accommodate laborers and company employees. It was a very small area of land surrounded by the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, a place to pass through quickly or not as quickly if you worked for the railroads.
In the early 1870s, the Utah Northern Railroad starts its construction north out of Utah into southeast Idaho with the desire to reach the mining regions of of Montana and to connect up with the Northern Pacific Railroad. And by 1878, the construction has come through the Portneuf Gap, on the Portneuf River Valley, and out onto the Snake River Plain on its way northward to Montana. And as it crosses Pocatello Creek, it establishes small construction along the siding to help in building the railroad line. And that, to many people, is the first of the creation of a community in Pocatello, north of the current the town site that will be built a few years later. The larger construction of Pocatello and the really establishment of a city here comes with railroad construction heading the other route.
A literal translation of the name Pocatello is a mystery, but nevertheless, it's tied to an influential Shoshone chief referred to by that name. Pocatello Junction grew as a railroad construction and service town. It was an important junction between rails running east-west and rails running north-south. Construction brought in more and more people through the 1880s, and as building increased, it created a whole new problem. This was not land owned or claimed by the railroad, or for that matter, by the United States. It was reserved by treaty for the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. While the railroad was granted the rights to cross the reservation, the surrounding lands still belonged to the tribes. Over 1 million acres, the reservation extended from the Blackfoot River in the north to the Marsh Valley region in the south. Pocatello Junction was laid down right in the middle of that reservation. So much of the story of early Pocatello is a series of negotiations between the U.S. government, the railroads themselves, local residents, and the tribes. The negotiations turned out to be a small step-by-step process to gain more land for the city and the railroad operations. As more residents poured in, it was difficult for them to find locations to build their housing legally. They end up encroaching on the Fort Hall Reservation, violating the treaty that had been negotiated. It was inevitable given the limited space. Consequently, there was a pressure to negotiate for more land to build a community and to provide space for the local ranching industry. The tribe sought better authority, better strength to monitor and enforce their land rights. Those pressures came together to establish a series of negotiations in the 1880s, and an agreement in 1888 established that the railroad could have a larger yard for its operations. The railroad got for the first time a full right-of-way to run its existing tracks through the reservation, and an area would be set aside for the city of Pocatello to build on. The lots were limited in size, and by federal law, the profits would be put in a fund that was to be used for the benefit of the Shoshone-Bannock people.
The town of Pocatello actually began on the first railroad right-of-way, which was just 200 acres. One line either side of the tracks and only so many feet each way for people to settle on. And it was gradually increased. By 1887, an additional 1,840 acres were got, and in late 1878, I think the railroad shops had been decided to be moved from Eagle Rock, which is now Idaho Falls, down, and all of this was bringing in people.
As the settlement continued to grow in population, the limited space again became an issue, and once again, people were settling illegally on the lands of the Fort Hall Reservation. Likewise, farmers and ranchers settled on the reservation lands, just on the outskirts of Pocatello. The tribes did not have the police authority to stop it, and federal agencies were not doing much to help. A new round of pressure came for the tribe to renegotiate their treaty and to cede a large southern portion of the reservation. By the mid-1890s, the federal government reached an agreement to buy over 400,000 more acres from the tribe, which was nearly half their reservation. These lands opened up to non-Indians, including present-day Pocatello southward, all the way through the McCammon area.
There are settlers in that area who had been there predating the reservation, and they had claims to the areas around the Cammon and the lush farmlands of the Marsh Valley, and those now can be more free in terms of ownership because it's no longer in the reservation. There's no longer dispute whether they have title to that land. And the lands all around Pocatello, particularly the rich farming lands just to the south and the immediate vicinity of Pocatello, are opened up in dramatic land rush in June of 1902. And at that point, it's comparable to the famous Oklahoma land rush of a few years earlier, and many veterans of the Oklahoma land rush, the Sooners of Oklahoma, have come to Pocatello to claim the latest of the great land openings of the American West. A lot of press brings people, and the population of Pocatello increases dramatically in the months prior to June of 1902.
Pocatello experienced tremendous growth, the characteristics and patterns of which continue through the rest of the city's early history. Early on, Pocatello was divided physically and socially by the railroad tracks. On the west side of the railroad tracks, where Harrison Avenue is today, many of the larger, nicer homes were built. Managers of the railroad settled in comfortable houses on the west side of the tracks, while working-class neighborhoods and temporary camps grew east of the tracks during this time period. Railroad laborers and seasonal workers resided here. The business district flourished on both sides of the railroad tracks, but particularly on the west side. As housing became more permanent, so did the population and the city. Stone buildings started going up, replacing the tent and wood structures that were there before. There was a more lasting feel to the city.
With people came families, and there was a need for schooling. The very first schoolhouse was held in the Railroad Hall at 145 North Harrison Avenue, which not only housed the first school classroom on the second floor, it also housed the fire brigade, the police department, and several other lodges met there. By 1890, the population had grown to 2,230, or 330 actually, so they were starting to feel a real need for a permanent and better solution for education. And along with increased railroad activity and more land, also came more workers and therefore a need for housing. Some of the earliest housing solutions were actually provided by the railroad. They brought in what I refer to as railroad houses. Originally, they were just the size of a railroad flatbed car, and they came in a couple of stages. In the late 1880s, they were short, pretty much 23 feet long, just as wide as a flatbed car. By the 1890s, when it was a wide gauge railroad, the railroad cars were not only a little wider, they were a little longer. So you'll see longer houses around, and you can spot them here and there. The city was incorporated as a village in April 29, 1889 in Bingham County. Bonneville County, or Bannock County, didn't exist at that time. It was still Bingham County, and they developed the Pocatello School District Number 1, and they got enough citizens together to actually float an agreement to build a schoolhouse. By 1895, there were enough students on the east side of town that they needed to build another school, so a stone schoolhouse was built on the block that now houses the Pocatello Post Office on Clark Street. That later became Bonneville Elementary. But along about that same time, in the early years, at 1901, Theodore Turner, who was in the state legislature at the time, actually floated the bill to create the Academy of Idaho, which has now grown to become ISU. They felt a need for some kind of higher education and technical training, and that's what the building was for originally. The Academy of Idaho was primarily a trade school.
Although new buildings were going up, the original school still remained a major focal point for activity in the community.
People met there. That's where parades started. You'll see it in old photos. community gatherings. If there had to be a large gathering of people to get information and hear speeches from somebody, that's where they would go.
Pocatello becomes a magnet for industrial workers from all over the world. We can see some of the portion in the 1890s again of Italian immigrants coming in. That shifts a bit after 1900, and the first decade of the 1900s sees an increase in immigration from Greece, particularly, and Pocatello becomes a real focal point for Greek community in Idaho and the broader Intermountain West. And after 1910, we see other groups come in, whereas by 1920, Pocatello has the largest African American population of Idaho and will remain that way through the 20th century. People coming again to work for the railroad, living almost exclusively on the east side of the tracks, a neighborhood that we today often call the Triangle neighborhood, simply because of its geographic shape, with the railroad yards cutting across at an angle across the street grid of Pocatello on the east side of the tracks. But that neighborhood became home to people of multiple languages, multiple nationalities, and ethnic cultural backgrounds.
My dad first came in 1911 from New Orleans, Louisiana, and later my mom came. And he didn't come just to work for the railroad, but many blacks and other ethnics were recruited to come here to work for what was called the Short Line Railroad, which later became Union Pacific. And in fact, some of the officials would actually go to southern cities and recruit blacks to come out here and work for the railroad. And a lot of them were eager to do it because it was a job and it was paying better than what they were getting there. They found out they had to live in this particular area, and that was from the railroad, Pocatello Avenue, over to about 7th Avenue, and then from Center Street, East Center Street to about Sublet, and so we were all in this particular area, and had churches there. The Greek Orthodox Church was there, a couple of black churches there, and there were quite a few grocery stores, especially owned by Greek families, and they were very, very important to us. It was interesting how those who did not want to rent to us in other areas, they created a situation where there was a lot of closeness, a lot of strength, a lot of socializing of the ethnics, and those ethnics were blacks, they were Mexican or Hispanic, whoever. There were Greeks, there were Italians, there were Japanese, Chinese, and I always remember one particular family lived in the next block from us. We lived on North 4th, and her name was Mrs. Hannah, and she was Middle Eastern, and she dressed that way. So we had that too. So we had a little bit of the world.
The promoters of Pocatello during that time period sought to bring in the comforts and the culture enjoyed in larger cities. Pocatello Women's Study League, among other progressive social organizations, had a desire to help uplift the community. They wanted Pocatello to become a city of permanence and influence.
To their mind, any community of respectable status needs to have certain elements, and one of those is a public library, a place of learning. New schools developed at this time period as well, because we want to be a permanent place. We want to be a respectable town of innovation and progress. And the symbols of that are schools. The symbols of that are opera houses and cultural centers, musical organizations. The symbols of that is also the library, built by the women who obtained the grants to get that put through. Women like Emma Stanrod, women like Dr. Minnie Howard, they really play a role in creating a more permanent place of a cultural center in Pocatello, and that's an important part of what is Pocatello, what life is like in Pocatello in those early years.
Pocatello was no longer the rough-and-tumble frontier town. It was a slow process as the city successfully transformed the wild railroad outpost to a growing, well-managed, and respectable city. What Pocatello essentially was at its conception, it still is today, a crossroads, a meeting point, and a gateway. Pocatello served these roles through the days of the fur trappers and westward migration. It continued this legacy as an industrial hub for the railroad transportation network. Though it didn't happen without sacrifice, the Shoshone and Bannock tribes lost lands and many lives, as well as a way of life that had been handed down for many generations. However, it has become a place of lasting importance. It is indeed a gateway to the rich Northwest and limitless opportunities. The Gate City continues to open doors to better futures and provides a place of diverse people and cultures.